This is Limelight America. Here's your host, Michael Drew Shaw.
Thank you, Lynette, and welcome to Limelight America, where we present one-on-one personal conversations with interesting people from all walks of life. These up-close encounters with people of the fascinating and inspiring kind include business, entertainment, sports, and artistic entrepreneurs, scholars, role models, and philanthropists who impact the quality of life for us all. A man was escorted to a table in the Persian Room at New York's Plaza Hotel by Richard, the maitre d', who suggested capellini with red sauce. 7 years earlier, Richard's brother, a chef, had left the Plaza to start his own restaurant in Cleveland, where the recipe had become so popular people were taking second orders home in jars. The man who came to dinner that night in New York was John Hartford, head of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. He was so impressed that within months, Chef Hector Boiardi's spaghetti with red sauce was on the shelf in every A&P store in America. And as they say, the rest is history.
You're listening to Limelight America.
James Dole graduated from Harvard and moved to Hawaii in 1899, intending to make his fortune raising pineapples. The young Ivy Leaguer got nothing but patronizing smiles from island farmers who had been trying to export the tropical fruit for years, but it spoiled too quickly to withstand the journey to markets on the mainland. Dole had an idea, but the farmers remained skeptical. Over the next 3 years, Dole and a small group of locals built a factory by hand. It was a cannery. Dole's answer to the spoilage problem was shipping the fruit in cans rather than in its fresh form. Pineapple grew to be one of Hawaii's largest industries, second only to tourism.
This is Limelight America, inspiring interviews with fascinating people. Here's your host, Michael Drew Shaw.
Thank you, Lynette, and welcome to Limelight America, where we present one-on-one personal conversations with interesting people from all walks of life. These up-close encounters with people of the fascinating and inspiring kind include business, entertainment, sports, and artistic entrepreneurs, scholars, role models, and philanthropists who impact the quality of life for us all. We will garnish the hour with some enticing side orders from time to time as we look back at unforgettable people, places, and events. We're glad to have you on board. Perhaps better known to millions as the Mayflower Madam, Sydney Biddle Barrows is a unique American success story. She started her business career as a retail executive at Abraham and Straus. At the time, it was the jewel in the crown of Federated department stores. She then moved on to May Company Corporate and became the divisional merchandise manager at a nationwide buying office. Sydney is probably the most unlikely authority on sales you'll ever meet. And for all of you who are thinking, but wait a second, the Mayflower Madam? But my business is different and you couldn't possibly learn anything from a former madam. Well, today you're going to learn how much your business and the world's oldest profession have in common. Our guest today on Limelight America, Sydney Biddle Barrows. But first, let's take a look at some coming attractions. To paraphrase the immortal words of Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street, green is good. And it is really good to Madison Avenue these days. The advertisers have climbed aboard the environmental bandwagon with a vengeance, whether it's on behalf of PCB dumping toxic polluters, miners leaching cyanide into once pristine mountain streams, or big oil claiming to be the guardians of the planet's future. We can save it together, providing you have an ad budget big enough. And that is a direct quote from George Parker's latest book, The Ubiquitous Persuaders. Longtime advertising industry creative consultant and genius, George Parker takes Vance Packard's late 1950s bestseller, The Hidden Persuaders, and drags it kicking and screaming into the 21st century. Everything you thought you knew about the snake oil purveyors on Madison Avenue is lovingly eviscerated, then reassembled in a brand new book called The Ubiquitous Persuaders. George Parker is outrageous and very British, and he is coming soon to Limelight America. Way back in the late 1980s, the late Billy Joe Smith, founder of Ebony Construction, who was an Entrepreneur of the Year award winner, an outstanding individual and a personal friend, asked me to write a song for a youth group he was organizing. I called it We Are the Future, and it was adopted as the official theme. 10 years later, I took Billy Joe's lead and tried to start a radio network for young adults. I formed the NTR Corporation, National Teen Radio. The idea was to build a talk show for teenagers who could call in anonymously and share what was on their mind. They would pick the subject, state their opinion, and then exchange ideas with other teenagers who would be invited to call in from around the country. There would be no adult interference, and the only ground rules were no bad language and no screaming at each other to make a point. This had never been done before, and to the best of my knowledge, other than several isolated cases on a few public radio stations, our children have never really had a platform to speak out in this way. Everybody told me it was an admirable idea and long overdue. But even though we organized 20 stations to help launch NTR, nobody was willing to sponsor it. You know how it goes. Everybody always wants to be first to buy the second one. Well, I still believe we too often take our kids for granted. And in our own defense, our kids too often pay little or no attention to what we try to teach them. NTR was never meant to be a generation bridge. It was meant to be sovereign territory for young adults only, with older adults being able only to listen in, and in the process do some learning of our own. Now, all that said, Limelight America will soon give birth to a new segment devoted to what kids have to say. We don't have a name for it yet, but we'll come up with something good, I promise you. In the meantime, we'll just call it what we've been calling it all along. The idea never died. It just went dormant for a while. So, NTR, coming soon to Limelight America.
Fascinating people, up close and personal. This is Limelight America.
It is my pleasure to welcome to the show Sydney Biddle Barrows, perhaps better known to millions of Americans as the former Mayflower Madam. She started her business career as a retail executive at Abraham and Straus. At the time, it was the jewel in the crown of Federated Department Stores. She moved on to May Company, and, a lot has happened since then. So let's get right to it. Sydney, welcome to Limelight America.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's first of all find out, give us a geographical connection, if you will. Where are you talking to us from this morning?
I live in New York City, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, just a few blocks above Lincoln Center.
Well, I'm sure the first question that is on everybody's mind, we'll get it over with, okay?
I know what it's going to be. Yeah, you go ahead.
How did a nice girl like you grow up to become a madam?
Well, as you can imagine, it's not exactly a career track that that I planned, and it certainly isn't one that my parents planned. But let me just see if I can just briefly get into it. I started out in the retail business, moved from company to company, and eventually got fired because I refused to participate in a kickback scheme. I may be a little crazy, but I'm not dishonest. And there I am on the unemployment line. Back then, you actually had to go and stand on the unemployment line. You couldn't do it through your computer. And I met another gal who, in a similar situation, and we started hanging out together. And one day, I went down to her apartment in Greenwich Village, and I walked in the door, and there she was unpacking a brand new stereo. And I knew she didn't have any money. She didn't have any more money than I did. So, of course, I was very curious as to where it came from, and, I asked her if it had fallen off the back of a truck. I mean, could I get one, too? And finally, she said, "Sydney, do you swear you won't tell anybody?" I said, "I swear." She said, "I answer the phone before an escort service." And I said, "Oh, What's an escort service? I did not have a clue. And so she told me what it was, and I was absolutely horrified. I certainly heard of this kind of thing before, but I never knew anyone who knew someone who did this. Oh, my goodness. So I asked a lot of questions, and because I was basically the only person who knew what she was doing, over the next couple of months, she would, tell me stories and what was going on. And so I got used to the idea. And one day she phoned me and said, Sydney, one of the girls in the office is leaving. Would you be interested in a job answering the phones? They paid $50 a night off the books, which back then was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And, I wasn't so sure. I was afraid of the police. I was afraid of the mafia. But, boy, at this point, I could really use the $50 a night off the books. So I go over there, and I meet a couple of the girls, and, no one's holding a gun to anybody's head. They all seem to be having a pretty good time. And, he'd been in business for 20-something years. I thought to myself, well, how bad could this be? So I took the job. Well, it was obvious from the very first night that I was there that, while it may have been the world's oldest profession, it was not being run very professionally by this particular person. And my girlfriend and I, were constantly Monday morning quarterbacking, he should have done this. I can't believe he doesn't do it that way. And, one day we just looked at each other and said, we're at least as smart as he is. We're definitely nicer than he is. Why don't we start our own escort service?
And the entrepreneurial light bulb goes off, right?
And that's what happened, and that's what we did, and that's how I got into it. I literally fell into it. I mean, as I said, as you can tell, it was not at all planned.
Well, let's back up. Let's put it on rewind and find out about Sydney as a little girl growing up. Give us the Reader's Digest version.
Well, I grew up in Rumson, New Jersey, which is an affluent community on the North Jersey coast. Went away to boarding school, Stoneleigh Burnham up in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and got kicked out in January of my senior year. That's a real long story. Basically for having too much fun. And they shipped me off to live with my father in Old Lyme, Connecticut, which I wish they'd done sooner because I had a grand old time at Old Lyme High. Then I had been accepted early decision at Elmira, which at that time it may still be actually, I don't know, an all-girls school up in Elmira, New York, which is near Ithaca and Cornell, and I liked an all-girls school. I liked having the boys around, but on the weekends. But who needs them, during the day? So the letter came in August saying, "Send us money now." And I remember standing in the kitchen, and my father looks at the letter. He looks up at me. He looks back at the letter, looks up at me, and says, "You're a pretty girl. Some rich man will marry you. Why should I spend the money to send you to college?" Which was kind of odd because his first wife, my mother, had gone to Bryn Mawr, and the one he was married to at the time had gone to Stanford, and the one he's married to now has an MBA from Columbia, so it's not as though he's into uneducated women, but anyway. So I didn't know what to do with myself, and I worked for a year trying to figure it out, and one day I'm walking through the mall, and I said, well, what am I going to do with my life here? And I thought, well, I like pretty clothes. I'll do something that has to do with pretty clothes. And so I ended up at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City in their buying and merchandising department because I'm not creative. I'm not a designer. And I graduated from there and ended up on the executive training program at Abraham and Strauss. And I guess that's the Reader's Digest version. Is that what you had in mind?
Then you move into the other profession. But let's move on now to what you're doing now. You've just published a book called, I love the title, Uncensored Sales Strategies. Well, we
had to get people to pick it up somehow.
Well, it's the hook, right?
Exactly.
It's like a good song, if you don't get them in the first 10 or 15 seconds, forget it.
Exactly.
All right, Uncensored Sales Strategies. You co-authored this with Dan Kennedy. Let our listeners know who Dan Kennedy is, for those who don't.
Oh, my God. Dan Kennedy is legendary. I mean, he is probably the smartest marketing person on the planet. He's an incredible copywriter. He gets $100,000 and up to write sales letters. He and a guy named Bill Glazer have something called Glazer Kennedy Insider Circle. And it is not an exaggeration to say that Dan Kennedy has probably made more people millionaires and even more people, in the get up to, a significant six-figure business than anyone else that exists. He's a genius, an absolute genius.
How did you meet Dan?
He found me. What happened is after Mayflower Madam, I wrote a book because I had to pay the lawyer's bills. The escort service eventually ended. There was a big legal case, and I had to pay lawyer's bills. So after the whole thing was over, I paid a $5,000 fine, and that was it. So I wrote this book, and it ended up at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and people started asking me to come and speak at their business groups, which really always surprised me. But anyway, they were paying me good money to do it, and so I did. And then people started coming up to me afterwards and asking me if I did consulting. Well, I had no idea what consulting was any more than I knew what an escort service was. So I started asking questions, well, what is it that you'd like me to do? I just asking all these kinds of questions just to find out what it was that a consultant did. And, after hearing a little bit about it, I thought to myself, I can do that. So that's how I got into the consulting business, is just, I fell into that too. And boy, let me tell you, the first several gigs I went on, I felt like I was so terrified they were going to find out what an incredible fraud I was. But fortunately for me, everyone's got a gift. For instance, technology is not my gift. But I do have a gift for looking at a business and being able to tell whether or not everything they're doing creates, maintains, and supports sort of the plot or story of their business. So Dan Kennedy hears about me through the Young Presidents Organization, which is a business group that I spoke to quite a bit. And he must have gotten a bootleg copy of my talk because I never let anybody tape it. It turns out that totally unknowingly, I was actually practicing all of the business strategies that he's constantly talking about and teaching to his members. And people are always coming up to him and saying, like, Dan, those sound like great ideas, but my business is different. And it just makes Dan and Bill crazy to hear people say, my business is different, because basically, fundamentally, all businesses really are alike. And I think that he invited me to come and speak at one of their big events because he just wanted to prove to people, listen, this girl ran an escort service. Here she is doing all the same things that I'm telling you to do, because all businesses are alike and your business is not different. And he found me.
This is Limelight America with Michael Drew Shaw.
A few minutes ago, one of the first things you said was that when you and your girlfriend would Monday morning quarterback the escort service, or the guy who was running it and you were working for, I thought it quite unique that your focus you didn't think about the business that you were analyzing so much as how he was running it. I mean, it was like it could have been an ice cream stand or a car dealership. It wasn't that it was an escort service. You just, for some reason, zeroed in on how the business was functioning, how you could make it better. Where did that come from?
Well, it was so clearly a very lucrative business. I mean, there were hundreds and thousands of guys out there who were looking for a much more upscale experience than this fellow was providing, and anybody else was providing. And the reason I knew this is because when I spoke to them on the phone, they sounded just like the fathers of my friends, my male relatives. I mean, I knew who these people were, and I knew that if some hoochie mama were to prance in their room, that they'd practically have a heart attack. But the thing is that Eddie and all the other people who run escort services, most of whom are lowlifes, they like hoochie mamas. They are into hot chicks and hot babes. But there's a huge segment of the population that is not into hot chicks and hot babes, and they were not being served. And it was so clear that if there were somebody out there that would provide a more refined, upscale experience, that there was a huge number of people who would jump on the opportunity to call and use a service, a business like this. So it just, it really was a business. That's all I ever saw it as. If for no other reason than no one was holding a gun to any of the girls' heads to do it. I mean, they'd already decided that they were going to do this. It was simply a matter of for whom were they going to work. And, we offered them a much better experience than anybody else out there.
Where did the Mayflower Madam moniker come from?
Well, after New York's Finest shut us down, of course, one of the biggest tabloids in the United States is the New York Post. And, of course, they just jumped on this story because, here we have, sex and high-class call girls and, executives and Arab sheiks and multimillionaires and, all this stuff. It was a story made in tabloid heaven.
Right.
They found out through a former boyfriend of mine, we all go out with at least one sleaze bag in our lives, and this one was mine. He called them up and said, "Oh, do you know who this really is? Her real name is Sydney Biddle Barrows, and, she was a debutante, and she went to, private boarding schools, and, her ancestors came over on the Mayflower, and she's in the social register, and, do you know who this really is?" And so they looked into it, and they found out that all this stuff was true, and they're always looking to sort of give someone a little moniker, a special name. Mm-hmm. And so, because my ancestors came over on the Mayflower, I became the Mayflower Madam.
I got it. Okay. Did Rupert Murdoch own the tabloid when this expose? Okay. Have you ever met Murdoch?
I have not.
Okay. I just finished a fascinating book called The Man Who Owns the News. It's quite a captivating story written by Michael Wolff, who is a future guest on Limelight America. Actually, in the long run, was it not beneficial to you?
Oh, absolutely. Let me tell you, I got so lucky because what happened at the time, there was a newspaper war in New York City between the Daily News, which is our other tabloid,
right,
and the New York Post. And both papers found out real quickly that when they had a story about me on the cover, that they sold many more papers. And so every single solitary day for 2 weeks, with the exception of the Sunday that Indira Gandhi was assassinated, I was on the front page of both papers. And back then, they had more than one edition. They'd have a morning edition, an afternoon edition, an evening edition. And what they do is they put different pictures on the cover and a different headline, even though the stories inside were basically the same.
Sure.
And people would buy all three, would all buy all three of them. So they were having a field day. And they also figured out that people wanted to read about a glamorous madam, about a blue-blooded, high-class madam. I mean, they weren't looking for something sleazy, but the whole Heidi Fleiss thing, that was sort of a sleazy, seedy story.
Right.
But they decided that mine was going to fly better and sell them more papers if they made it a real sort of classy story.
Right.
I mean, I just totally lucked out with that. I really did. They did me a huge favor.
We're talking with Thaddeus Warrow, the author of Radicals and Visionaries. I have to believe you have a couple of favorites.
Growing up seeing I Love Lucy, I always considered Lucy to be a brilliant comedian and Desi just her straight man. Desi was not only an excellent businessman, but he was quite an innovator.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Winters, and I want to say, okay, are you ready? You have a level here and you're all set.
When did you really first come to the realization that you were a star?
Well, not to play a game of semantics with you, I still don't consider myself a, quote, star.
All right, you build companies to sell them. Now, I started out with Chongqing Chinese Foods in 1944, and I sold to R.J. Reynolds Tobacco for $63 million in 67. I have 7 banks because I had to put the money somewhere.
Radio's most talked about talk show, Limelight America with Michael Drew Shaw.
Our guest, Sydney Biddle Barrows, for those of you just joining us, the Mayflower Madam, and we've already determined that the Mayflower is the boat that her ancestors came over and not the hotel. And we're not going to dwell on this any longer. We're going to move on to where you are in your life today. And I'm going to go back to what we were talking about in the last segment. You just published a book called Uncensored Sales Strategies. You co-authored it with the legendary Dan Kennedy, one of the brilliant marketing minds. You have a successful consulting practice. You give presentations all over the country. How did you, well, you've sort of touched on this, but as you moved from being a madam to becoming this super successful businesswoman, over what period of time did this transformation occur? How many years did it take?
Oh, well, let's see. I would say I started speaking to business. I started out speaking to colleges. Then I started speaking to business groups. I would say 1988, 89. And then I probably started doing the consulting around 89, 90. It just sort of slowly built up from there. And then Dan Kennedy found me about 3 years ago. And, what went from sort of this little business really exploded into a much bigger business, because now all of a sudden I had the whole Glazer Kennedy Insider Circle membership, as potential clients, and many of whom have hired me. It was a progression, and there were some really lean years. I'm not going to lie to you. There were some very lean years there. And sometimes I had to do other things to supplement my income. But I, between speaking and consulting, you can make a pretty good living.
At the very beginning in your book, Uncensored Sales Strategies, you write that one of the big factors in your success is recognizing and using the lessons you learned from your very first job in your retailing career. Tell us about that.
I would say that probably the number one thing that I learned, and I hope that every single solitary person listening to this who's in business will pay attention, is that you are not your customer. And I just finished talking in the last segment about how Eddie, the guy that owned the escort service that I moonlighted for as a call girl, he thought he was his customer, and that, and so he had the kind of call girls working for him that he would have liked to have seen, not realizing that there are other people out there who wanted something different. I started out as an assistant buyer in the bath shop. And one day my buyer took me out into the market because we needed some more shower curtains. So there we are sitting in the showroom, and the salesman is showing us some of the most hideous shower curtains that you've ever seen. And my boss, Mary, starts writing orders for these things. And I said, what are you doing? I mean, this is hideous. I wouldn't put this in my bathroom on a bet. And she looked at me and she said, Sydney, she said, you are not your customer. She said, just because you wouldn't have it in your bathroom doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people out there, and those people are our customers, and that's what they want. Well, I just couldn't believe it. And so when the order came in, I watched those shower curtain boxes like a hawk. And sure enough, they sold. And I think that that's the number one thing that the people in business out there have to understand, is that just because you don't like it or you wouldn't pay money for it or whatever, doesn't mean that that there are a lot of people out there who would. And so you've really got to know what it is your customer's looking for, not what it is you think they ought to have or that you want to sell. What is it that they want? And that is the number one thing that I learned.
I think amazingly, the auto industry seems to have missed that point.
Oh, yeah, big time.
I mean, for years they've been building cars that they think we ought to buy instead of what we want to buy. But, of course, I guess that's kind of sort of catching up with them.
Well, Lee Iacocca, one of the reasons Lee Iacocca did so well, you may or may not know the story, is that when he was walking through an assembly plant one day, one of the workers had enough balls to come up and say to the president of the company, this car, meaning the Mustang, talking about the Mustang, would make a great convertible. And so Lee Iacocca thought about it for a second, and he said, all right. He said, you make one, and what we're going to do is we're going to take it out, and we're going to see if the girls, when we're driving around, if it attracts the girls. Because if it attracts the girls, then men will buy it. And sure enough, it did, and this car became a huge hit. And it's all because Lee Iacocca said, let's build something that people want to buy.
You also give credit to learning lessons from other successful businesses and applying those nuggets of knowledge to yours. And you give one particularly great example. Share that with us.
Yeah, this is such a great example of your business is not different. Now, I ran a service business, but I actually got this idea from a product business, and the product was cosmetics. I believe it was Estee Lauder that first started this whole gift with purchase thing, and for those men of you out there who do not know what gift with purchase is, once or twice a year, every cosmetics company has this special deal where they have they have some kind of a bag. That's always the thing. They always have some kind of a bag that they fill with all kinds of goodies like lipsticks and sample sizes of things, and things that they basically want people to try, and then with the hopes that they'll come back and then buy more of them.
Sydney Biddle Barrows, Part 2, next week.
Limelight America is produced by the LA Radio Network.